An annual growth rate of 2.6% last year, the fastest since 2007. Well, with me in the studio is Adam Memon, Head of Economics Research at the Centre for Policy Studies. The CPS is an independent think tank wedded to the no sign of interest rate rise. In fact, the Bank of England members of the Monetary Policy Committee are unanimous in saying there won't be a rise, or at least not recommending a rise. And wages are edging ahead of low inflation. So it's all looking really rather good. Perfect setting for the incumbent party in the run-up to an election. 100 days to go. But the main centre of economic debate seems to be who's, more explicit about spending cuts. Why on earth are they focusing the economic debate about spending cuts and fiscal responsibility?
Well, if I go back to what you said earlier, that this is a perfect set of figures, I don't think it is perfect. There's definitely been lots of good figures, and whether it's in terms of nominal wages or whether it's in terms of growth today. A lot of uncertainty. Specifically, the reason there is so much debate about that question is because that's the real thing that governments can actually change. It's what they have the most control over. So growth may be, growth and inflation, unemployment, these may be what governments are judged against, but what governments can do about it is what they do with spending and taxes and their other sort of regulatory policies. So I think when you're looking at the next few years and looking at what different parties are firstly willing and secondly able to cut spending, and I think that there's certainly there'll be a lot of probing, continue to be probing of the opposition's, both the opposition and the governments, because the opposition seems to have come up. They say that they will bounce the current budget, but what does that mean precisely? How will they do that? Which taxes might they increase, and similar questions for the government as well.
Very, very unclear, in fact.
Yes.
And when pressed, rarely come out with a crisp, good, clear answer. Obviously determined not to give a good, clear answer because they don't really know themselves. You say that this is an area, when I asked why do they keep batting on about spending cuts and so on, you said it's one area where they have some degree of control. But I must say they don't really seem to have much degree of control over government spending, because there are, first of all, so many areas that they have decided themselves that they can't cut, and a lot of the areas where there is room for manoeuvre, they seem to have very little success in actually doing the cutting. It almost seems beyond their control.
Well, so yes, it's important to be clear about which parts of government spending they do have. So it's departmental spending. So the government spending can be roughly divided into what's called DEL, Departmental Expenditure Limits, and AME, Annually Managed Expenditure. Now, DEL, so department spending, DEL, the government has a direct control over that. So that's the Treasury setting limits, spending limits for each government department. And then the other side is spending which government may have targets and may be able to say we want to cut spending on that side, but ultimately, depending on the situation of the economy and demands on welfare and other such things, the government has much less control over that. Now, over the areas where the government has had direct control on departmental spending, they have overachieved the spending targets that they were set out. Then there's actually been an underspend. So departments have not only achieved spending cuts which were outlined, but they've actually spent less than the Treasury set out for them. The reason why total government spending as a whole has not seen a massive reduction in the same way that departmental spending is because the other side of spending, whether it's in terms of welfare, things like tax credits, in particular, and housing benefits, where government can set some restrictions but can't ultimately decide how much is spent. That demands on that side have increased, and spending on that side has pushed up. So overall, it doesn't look as impressive as if you just look at departmental spending.
And those elements that you just outlined have pushed up despite falling unemployment.
Yes.
Is that because there's some sort of lag in timing? Or, I mean, how can that be? When someone comes off benefits, they also come off housing benefit. Or maybe they don't. Maybe if their wages are so low, they still keep an element of housing benefit, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. So
Yes.
If someone moves from being unemployed to unemployed to getting a job, it really depends on how much they're earning to whether they are still claiming benefits. So someone who's earning, say, £16,000 a year, that is not a huge amount to live on, especially if you're looking after a household and you have some children. Then it's likely that they will still continue to be able to claim tax credits and some housing benefits, but also other sort of means-tested benefits as well. So that does mean that total spending will not fall as much. I mean, so you will lose jobs. Government will only be spending job seekers allowance, for example,
Yes.
out of work benefits. But in-work benefits still remain a very large section.
Indeed.
So as wages, so that really does mean that wage growth, real wage growth, is critical both to people's living standards, but also to how much demand for welfare rises as well.
And that's a real key political point of debate, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, with some calling for, come on, companies, pass on your profitability in the form of higher wages, and opposition saying that wouldn't it be better to pay a better minimum or even living wage rather than having these in-work benefits being paid?
Well, in an ideal society, you would certainly want companies to be paying higher wages than for the state to have to subsidise low wages. It's more efficient generally, and I think there's certainly an element of dignity that comes from the fact that you're no longer having to take money from welfare system. That doesn't mean that it's indignified to claim benefits. Some people need to because they simply don't have enough to earn. But there is, I think, people do feel when they have a job that there is an element of success there, that they are able to look after themselves and rely upon themselves as well. But yes, there are many aspects of why wages haven't grown, and certainly I think there needs to be a much greater focus on how we can actually increase real wages within a market economy.
Well, I'll ask you directly on that. I guess you've done some research on it. I think we have actually, when you've been in the studio, chatted about this before. But why haven't wages grown? Is it the lack of union power? Is it the effects of immigration? Is it a demographic thing? Is it because companies haven't felt that they're profitable enough to pass it on?
Well, ultimately, in the long term, real wages are determined by productivity, and if a company, or if as a country, where for every hour we are working we're not producing any more, then there's nothing really to back higher wages. So, and unfortunately, productivity in our country has been particularly poor, both by historical comparisons, but also compared to other countries. So our economy has grown strongly, and unemployment has fallen sharply, but for every hour working, we're not really producing that much more. There's some signs maybe that it's ticking up, but that is the key drag on real wages. There are other things as well. I think if you look at the makeup of the labour market as well, in terms of skill level, so in 2014 in particular, the employment growth was coming especially from middle and lower skilled workforce, whereas before it came from higher workforce, so from higher skilled. So that does mean that'll apply a drag on wages, and not only this year but next year as well, because you're starting from a lower base. So even if you get a 3% wage growth, nominal wage growth, because it's in aggregate terms, then it won't add much to total real wage growth. I think as well there are other things as well, whether it's to do with the public sector side of things. Of course, there's been an enforced restrictions, freeze on a large number of public sector workers.
Yes.
Of course, a function of the deficit as well.
Yeah. Adam, for the moment, thanks very much. We'll just have a listen to this.
The Big Number. Demystifying Finance. There's a difference between the national minimum wage and the living wage. The national minimum wage rate per hour depends on your age and whether you're an apprentice. You must be at least school leaving age to get it. The level of the minimum wage is updated each year. While the legislation around our current minimum wage is relatively recent, wage restrictions of a very different kind go a long way back. In 1349, King Edward III decreed the Ordinance of Labourers. That actually set a maximum wage for labourers. The king and many other landowners had become concerned at rising labour costs and would fine employers for paying anything above the maximum decreed rate. That legislation was eventually repealed, and although we now have a national minimum wage, many people believe that doesn't offer workers enough protection, and there's therefore a call for what's known as a living wage. The Living Wage campaign was launched in 2001 by parents in East London who were frustrated that working 2 minimum wage jobs left no time for family life. It's since gained a lot of attention and receives broad party political support. Needless to say, the living wage is higher than the minimum wage. While those who support the living wage movement believe that paying the living wage is a sign of good practice in employment, it's not legally enforceable. Paying the national minimum wage is a legal obligation on all employers.
It's 19 minutes past 1 here on Share Radio. It's the afternoon show, Investment Perspectives, with me, Ed Mitchell, and with me in the studio is Adam Memon, Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies. And we're looking at the latest indicators from the UK economy, particularly in the context of it being election year, not long to go. And we touched on the subject of productivity. I must say, since I've been looking at economic textbooks since 1970, that's 45 years of looking at economics, and productivity always features in there somewhere, but I've always wondered how it's actually measured and what the main factors are that influences it. Why are some countries more productive than others? Well, Adam, you've done a bit of research on this. First of all, how do we measure it? And secondly, what are the main influences on increasing or decreasing productivity?
Well, productivity is really the residual that we get from looking at how much output has grown and how much the number of hours has grown as well. So if total output in the economy GDP is growing faster than the number of hours we're working, then productivity is rising, and we just use the get the figure from those two figures.
Right.
So it's more. Sometimes it can be if one quarter there's suddenly lots of people have taken on a huge number of hours for some reason or not. An output hasn't necessarily grown. That it could show that productivity has seen a big shrink in one quarter. But you have to look at it over time, over a number of years, to get a proper reflection of it.
Do you think that Britain is a particularly productive economy or not? I mean, in terms of international comparisons, where do you think we stand?
Well, globally, we're a very rich country compared to the vast majority of other countries. So our productivity is very high. Compared to developed economies, we are not actually, other developed countries, so the G7 countries, we're not actually that productive at all. The French and the Germans, for every hour that we work, those countries are about 30 percentage points more productive than output is about 30 percentage points higher than it is for every hour worked here. In the US, in Italy, in Japan, elsewhere. So they are starting all from a higher level. Now, the growth rate is different. So until 2000, and I think over a number of years until 2007, the growth rate of productivity in the UK was one of the fastest, actually. So we were catching up. We were doing quite well, actually, compared to the other countries. But since 2007, we have underperformed almost all the other economies. I think possibly only Italy might have done worse than the UK in terms of G7 productivity. So internationally, it's concerning. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what can be done to improve productivity. And also, a thought comes into my head, is there an element of, you say it's the gross domestic product measured by the number of hours it took to produce that. Is there also a cost involved in that how much did those hours cost to produce that gross domestic product? Is that a dimension of it, if you like?
Well, in terms of what can we do to increase it, we may, I hope not, we may be resigned to a slower productivity growth rate, and that's partly because our economy, the structure of it has changed. One of the reasons our productivity grew so quickly before 2007 is because the financial sector and because oil and gas were highly productive sectors. They very big output for a small number of a relatively small employment share. And so those were growing very fast. And since 2007, those sectors of the economy, and especially now with oil and gas contracting, those sectors of the economy could well be permanently smaller as a share of our economy, which means that the growth rate will be, the overall cross-economy growth rate could be smaller. That doesn't necessarily mean productivity we're doomed to slow productivity forever, but it could cut the growth rate in the post-recession compared to the pre-recession. One thing which is interesting is that manufacturing sector productivity before the crisis and after the crisis is almost invariably twice as fast as services sector productivity. So if you wanted to see faster cross-economy productivity growth, a larger manufacturing share of your economy might be one way of getting about there. There are plenty of reasons why that may or may not happen, but manufacturing is a higher productivity sector in the UK at least. There are other things as well in terms of looking at investment ratios. Capital investment had been weak during the recession and in the immediate aftermath as well. As that rises, it should feed into greater sort of capital formation and companies looking to develop new technologies and other such things and take on existing technology. So that should feed into productivity growth later on as well.
The United States economy is currently held out as being the one main engine of world economic growth, at least by the World Bank, I think it was, that talked about one engine. They didn't talk about China. The reason I raise that is because is productivity particularly high in the United States?
Yes, productivity is, compared to most other countries, is very high in the US. Their labour market, the structural labour market is quite different there, and I think one of the things that we saw compared to the UK is that unemployment in the US rose very quickly, and the productivity remained high in the US as well, and that's largely a function of companies laying off lots of people very quickly in the immediate when the recession started. So that meant that companies were still producing the relatively similar, a smaller output, but not a huge GDP contraction. But because they laid off so many workers, the residual productivity figure which we got remained higher. The reverse situation happened here, and unemployment didn't fall anywhere near as much as So I remember in 2008 we were thinking 3.5 million people unemployed, and the peak was about 2.5, just above 2.5 million. Still way too high, but not as bad as been feared. There was one of the consequences of that was that productivity remained very low. That's a sacrifice that you take for lower employment. I'm fine with that. If it meant that 1 million fewer people were unemployed, then that's lower productivity is a sacrifice. The problem now is why in 2015, from the period 2012, 13, 14, 15, has productivity stayed so low when unemployment has continued to fall.
I mean, sticking with this theme of productivity, because it does seem to go to the heart of the matter, I wonder what the latest figures over the last few months for productivity in the Greek economy would be. There's no reason why you need to you know about this or you don't know about this, but because the economy there is growing, admittedly from a devastated low base, and there are a lot of people out of work. I'm just wondering if the number of hours that are producing the GDP that has been rising, whether productivity is actually improving in Greece.
So the massive... I think I saw some graphs recently which showed the output contraction in Greece was about 21% or something, outrageously large, especially compared to the other economies. But at the same time, unemployment, so total employment, has also seen an almost equivalent percentage reduction. So in a way, the residual figure that you get for productivity probably hasn't changed that much.
Right.
If there's been, I think, 2%, a very small growth rate of output in recent months in Greece, and unemployment has begun to fall slightly as well. But in that sense, what we're looking at productivity is less useful, because that's more just a function of hours and output. What's really interesting in productivity is looking at over a 5-year period and saying, okay, per hour, actually productiveness. How effective we are in actually producing stuff, rather than over a 6-month period, productivity saw a big change because unemployment fell drastically, or we suddenly took on more hours, or people moved from the black economy into the formal economy, and such things.
I started by saying just how many positive factors were surrounding the UK economy. There are obviously plenty of potential flies in the ointment, one of which is the slowdown in the Eurozone economies, maybe Europe in general, that will impact the UK economy in the sense that it can't grow in isolation.
Yes, certainly. And especially as you consider the fact that the current account deficit in the UK is about 6% of GDP. Current account deficit is now larger than the budget deficit, which is a serious problem in terms of our ability to increase export volumes and rebalancing and all that sort of stuff. It means that one key section of what the components of GDP, there's a serious constraint on that. And if you consider that we export more to the Netherlands than we do to China and India put together, then that's a real problem. Equally, there are I think people have begun to recognise that. Certainly business appears to recognise that, and businesses you are seeing a gradual shift towards exports outside of the Eurozone. We can't be reliant upon a shrinking trade bloc like that, and the constraints on Eurozone growth remain quite severe.
Indeed. Adam, for the moment, we'll return in a moment, but first, let's have a listen to the main news headlines with Natalie Webb. Maybe we can't.
News headlines at 1:30. The UK economy grew at its fastest rate for 7 years in 2014 by 2.6%, but figures show a sharper slowdown in the final quarter than had been expected, mainly due to falling energy prices. With 100 days to the general election, the campaign appears to be shaping up as wealth versus health. David Cameron says he would cut the annual benefits cap down from £26,000 to £23,000 if he wins. Meanwhile, Labour has launched a 10-year plan for the health service. About 300 Auschwitz survivors have gathered at the site of the former Nazi death camp to mark the 70th anniversary of its liberation. The commemoration will be held at the site in southern Poland, where 1.1 million people, the vast majority of them Jews, were killed between 1940 and 1945. 17 charities and organisations have teamed up in an attempt to stop multinational companies avoiding their taxes. The Tax Dodging Bill campaign calls on the next government to make it a priority. ActionAid, Oxfam and the National Union of Students are among those who want MPs to pledge the billions of pounds it would bring into the Treasury to tackling poverty. Cities from Boston to New York and Philadelphia are shutting down against a monster storm that could dump up to 3 feet of snow. Thousands of flights in and out of northeastern US have also been cancelled. And Russia's credit rating has been cut to junk, or below investment grade, by US ratings agency Standard & Poor's for the first time in a decade. S&P gave Russia a rating of BB+, which puts it at the same level as Indonesia and Bulgaria. And in the city, the FTSE 100 was recently trading at 6,823. That's down by around 29 points. The pound buys $1.50 and €1.33. That's Share Radio News headlines. The time is now 28 minutes to 2, and it's back to Ed.
Natalie, thanks very much.
Investment Perspectives with Ed Mitchell on Share Radio.
Welcome back. Yeah, Share Radio with me, Ed Mitchell, and with me in the studio is Adam Memon, Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies. We've been looking at the UK economy, various aspects of it, growth, the number of positive factors around. We looked at how spending cuts can be achieved, given that so much of government spending is ring-fenced. Then we looked at the whole issue of productivity. I just want to return to this idea of austerity, sort of budget responsibility, fiscal responsibility. Why has it taken such a grip that both of the main parties somehow think it's almost taken as read that any responsible government should be austere in the way that it goes about its budgeting?
So that really depends on what we mean by austere. So austere, if that means ensuring that total spending is not a huge amount above the amount that is generated in revenue, then so be it. But I think different people have different understandings of what austere means. Clearly, there is a consensus that budgets must be balanced at some point, and the Labour Party has agreed, not fully, but to some extent, has bought into the idea that they need to cut borrowing. They'll do it at a much slower rate, and they'll have to increase taxes as well to do that. But I think that it taps into a general feeling that borrowing at such high levels, even when the economy has recovered, is unacceptable for a number of reasons. Debt interest payments rising as a total spending. Debt interest payments will be 8% of total spending in 2020. It does lead us at risk, probably not to severe risk, but does lead us at risk if there's another market turbulence and governments running high deficits, that this is more exposed. There are a number of other reasons as well. I think one idea that I do want to focus on in terms of austerity in particular is that it's a chance to reshape the way we fund and deliver services. So if you look at not just government, but big organisations are always more radical when they are faced with a fiscal imperative. So efficiency, it comes when they're forced to be efficient.
Yes.
And if you look at local councils, for example, in 2010, there was a lot of people, whether it's in local authorities and other unions and others, people saying, if you cut spending at this rate, there will be a terrible disaster and what have you. And of course, it's certainly not been easy, but the local governments themselves accept that about £10 billion have been saved in purely efficiencies. So not in cutting back services necessarily, although some councils have cut some services, of course, but on an aggregate, big efficiencies have been made. Now, would those efficiencies have been made? So would that money have been saved for taxpayers, we the customers of government, if there wasn't an imperative to cut spending and to balance budgets? I don't think so. And I think the same can be said for the next 5 years as well. Would we take this opportunity to reshape the way we fund and deliver services if we weren't obliged to by the fiscal imperative?
I get that, yes, that if you're able to point out that, look, we've got to make these cuts because look at the state our finances in, that is almost an additional benefit, is that you also get those forced efficiencies. I mean, some people have alleged or have made the criticism that is an ideological thing, although I don't see why being more efficient is ideological. But I suppose that the danger would be if you have these fiscal imperatives, it means that things are perhaps going a bit wrong with the economy. Then you layer on the idea of austerity. That might be counterproductive in that it's worsening the economic situation. That austerity can be a bad economic tactic at the wrong time in kind of the business cycle, if you like.
It can be, and if you look at some countries in the Eurozone, elsewhere, they have the way that they have structured their fiscal programs within the context of not having no flexibility in monetary policy. Then of course, it depends on where you are and the structure of the economy and so forth. But I don't believe that argument can be made about the UK.
No.
I think that if you look back in 2010 with a deficit of about 10% of GDP, which is really not, there's no real comparison in the peacetime for the UK having such a high deficit, at the same time as there being such market turbulence in the Eurozone and elsewhere, and at the same time of there being generally a sense that government had become bloated and inefficient in many respects. Not and if looking at public sector productivity, that 1997 to 2010, the ONS just estimates that basically no productivity growth in public services. So I don't also think that the impact on growth, which is the key question as well, of there being of deciding to cut spending and to basically to cut deficits, that it's not clear that the impact on growth has been so large that it outweighed the necessity to cut deficits, and as well as the other reforms which have come along with that as well.
Because there's absolutely no doubt that the Greek economy needed reforming, fundamental reforms there. But currently, with it still being, there are signs of revival, but with it still being on its knees, further austerity, and this is what the Greek electorate are saying, is not the right medicine. No longer is austerity the right medicine at the moment for an economy that is a near basket case.
Well, in that sense, so austerity in the sense of massive reductions in deficits and spending and big tax increases, that is insufficient in itself. So for the UK as well, it's insufficient. It has to come with flexible monetary policy and supply side reform and general reform of our economy. So what happened in Greece is that the focus should have been on reforming an economy which is semi-socialist in many respects, which large sections of the middle classes. So in this country we talk about tax avoidance as being very rich people, but in Greece and not just Greece but also Italy, it's just sort of professionals as well who don't feel the necessity to pay taxes, and that, of course, that has a consequence for law and order and for different industries who feel that they can get away with flouting rules, and what does that mean for competition? It's just a reform in a country in dire need of reform, but the focus was entirely on deficit reduction and not on reform, and the consequence is Syriza being elected, and unfortunately that is a result of an economy which was governed from Brussels, and where the Greek government had very little control over what it should have done. That's not to say that the Greek government would have done much better, because let's remember, before they joined the euro, they defaulted and they had many problems before then as well. So unfortunately,
yes. And this is one of the dangers of quantitative easing, the huge package that was revealed last week by the ECB, is that it just buys more time for them to continue with their bad habits.
Yes, and the Germans certainly fear that. I remember, I think, in 2012 and when Berlusconi was 2011, when Berlusconi was leaving, and they said, well, the Germans just did not want at all to launch any QE program at that time. When Mario Monti as well, Mario Draghi in 2012, he said, no, we'll do whatever it's taken. But 2.5 years later, they have enacted QE, and in a way, you might understand, well, we don't really want to be spending this much money. We don't really want to be so monetary expansion, have this huge expansion, if all that means is that governments can ease off and say, okay, we don't need to reform anymore because the ECB will look after us. Now, that's a real concern for them. But the solution then is to say that structural reform must come alongside monetary expansion. So you can't have one without the other. Now, monetary expansion, the QE, is only the anaesthetic before the surgery. The surgery is a structural reform, and many of those have yet to take place. But if you then, as you say, if the Germans see them just taking the morphine and just taking the QE and then not doing the actual hard work of structural reform, then you can understand why they'd be quite angry with that. So bind the two together.
But in many ways, the Germans are the authors of their own problems, aren't they? They pushed for the idea of a Eurozone, good Europeans, the whole ethos of ever further movement towards union. They're as enthusiastic about that as the French and the Belgians and so on. They must have seen the likely outcome, plus the fact they've benefited hugely as an exporting nation from the weaker euro.
Well, yes, they have benefited from a depreciated euro, and if they were to leave the euro, one of the key reasons they want to keep the euro together, other than the political factors, of course, is that they would have a very expensive Deutschmark and their exports would suffer. They are very keen. They have pushed on this idea. They're not very keen, of course, for fiscal union, because that would mean much heavier liabilities on the German taxpayer. I would say, though, that probably I think they are so wedded to the idea of the monetary union and the idea of the European Union as well, beyond the Eurozone, that they are probably prepared to do quite horrible things to their own taxpayers in order to keep the whole system together. I suspect with Syriza as well, there will be some form of compromise to allow them, because for them, fiscal austerity is the means to maintain the Eurozone and maintaining the European Union. But if fiscal austerity is seen to be the threat to the monetary union and the euro and the EU, then they'll ease off on that, because the important thing for them is to keep the euro and keep the EU together.
There must be many ways to fudge the issue by lengthening paying times and just easing it off, but surround it in language that still looks tough, but in fact beneath the surface is an easing and a compromise. It'll have to happen, won't it?
Well, yes. I mean, so when your GDP to deficit debt ratio is 170% and has increased so significantly, it seems almost impossible for that to be paid off, or that to be cut significantly. There will have to be some compromise, because otherwise the Greek government will. Well, I mean, you can't. That has a democratic mandate to do that now. So there's a tension now between the democracy of Greece and the rigidities of the Eurozone. But there has to be some form of compromise. Otherwise, there'll be inevitable clash, and either Greece will be forced out of the Eurozone. The ECB and the Commission and Berlin will have to compromise in some respects. Yeah.
Adam, thanks very much for your time today. It's a pleasure to have you in the studio, as always. Thanks very much. That was Adam Memon, Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies.
The Big Number.